Hi, so I want to say a little bit more about style in this poem and meter. So first I want to talk about meter. I mentioned the trochee in the last video, the trochaic patterns that I was seeing. In some of his work, Kamanyaka likes to use what is called sprung rhythm, S-P-R-U-N-G. And that creates a more like conversational, casual sort of rhythm. It isn't notably like metric. Although you might notice some like stresses followed by several unstressed portions in a poem or in a given line. So I would definitely say, I mean, it's possible that this uses sprung rhythm. Sprung rhythm is kind of hard to define, but I do definitely get a sense of the sort of natural spokenness of the poem. It doesn't sound stilted or anything like that. It doesn't sound like it's in a form. So that probably ties in well with the kind of speaker we're dealing with. I think the speaker is, and we talked about this before, but I think the speaker is a young, perhaps teenage boy. That might also tie in with some characteristics that are unique to Kamanyaka. I mean, if you ever read much of Kamanyaka's work, you will discover that he loves to use, the ampersand. He loves that. And often he will capitalize the first letter of the first word of a line. So because I know that he often does that in his work, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on how those features apply to this poem. I just know that that's something that Kamanyaka does. If I wanted to, I could go into more detail, like tie it into the overall, meaning of the poem if I wanted to. But I'll just suffice to say that the capitalization of the first word or the first letter, the first letter of the first word of each line, to me suggests that there's a sense of this being a created thing, that it's a poem, but also we get that sense of casualness from the use of the ampersand instead of spelling out the word and. I also think we've talked about symbolism. We've talked about some imagery, right? I might point out more things as we go along, but I do remember us talking about those aspects. I also want to say that this poem, when we think about lyric poetry, narrative poetry, dramatic poetry, to me this poem seems like definitely narrative. It's telling a story, but also it appears to be lyric in that you're getting a sense of feeling from the speaker, even though it isn't overt. He's not saying, oh, and I was so surprised, or I was so scared. He doesn't say anything like that, but we get through inferring, we get an impression of how the speaker might feel. So I would still probably categorize this as lyric narrative, a lyric narrative poem. I think I mentioned irony before. Certainly the name Cleanth is ironic because Cleanth means what? Clean and pure. I think that's what I mentioned in a previous video. So we know that Cleanth is anything but, right? We also have what's called allusion, A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N. I think that the name Salome is a biblical allusion. And we are invited as the reader to kind of make associations with, the stories, probably the one big story that we know from the Bible regarding Salome. All right, I do also want to point out some alliteration. So if we look at, I don't know if I'll always give the line number because these lines don't have numbers. I mean, they're just directly from his book. But but probably the first episode of alliteration I see is behind those fiery branches. So alliteration is the repetition of a consonant sound, typically at the beginning of words that are near each other. All right, so some people argue that the sound has to appear in the stressed syllable of a word. I don't necessarily adhere to that. I mean, if the sound is noticeable to me and it's at the beginning of the word, whether it's in a stressed syllable or not, I pay attention to it. So I think of that as alliteration. So behind those fiery branches, we're hearing B, right? So why would he want to use alliteration here? I mean, I know that alliteration is used commonly in poetry, but you want to think about what is it doing to the reader? What is it drawing our attention to? How is it connecting to the theme that we're formulating in our mind as we read? All right. And also just the overall impression that we're getting of a poem. So behind those fiery branches, so definitely my attention is drawn to the fact that it's behind, something is hidden, and then branches. I think it's interesting that he didn't say leaves. You know, he uses branches there. So she's like kind of behind a tree of some kind. And then probably another example of that, and I might be skipping some, I might not catch everything, but of course we have Black Baptists. And this draws our attention to the fact that the other people in the creek who are a part of this church, Tree of Life and Sweet Beulah, are black. He's already mentioned that the girl who is skinny dipping is white. And then farther down, we see fishing. The fishing cork danced and then disappeared. Yeah. Now these occur in two different lines, but I still notice them as alliteration. Also, you will note that disappeared. I mean, the stress in disappear is in the peer part, right? So not in the dis. But to me, that doesn't make any difference. I still hear the D's very prominently. So danced and then disappeared, which draws my attention to the fact that the cork was moving around, right? And then it went under the surface of the water. And he's not, again, as I mentioned in another video, he's not paying attention to that. Let's see, any other episodes of alliteration? I didn't jot any down, so I'm going to, well, wait a second. We do have another one at the end here. Trapped in tyranny. So trapped in tyranny, I would say that is alliteration. And again, we want to think about how is this applying to the overall meaning that we are deriving from the poem. The sense of being trapped under tyranny, of course, that's emphasized with the two T sounds there. And we can talk about that more later. I'll mention this again when we talk about theme. But I'm going to move on and talk about some other sounds that I've noticed in the poem in the next video.